Thank you, Packy, for coming on and joining me on the show today. It's great to have you. You are the author of the Not Boring newsletter, Investing with Not Boring Capital, advisor to A16Z Crypto, and more generally, just kind of playing the great online game, as you've called it, which I think is a really interesting way to phrase it. And it's a great piece on the Substack for people who want to go find that maybe before they listen into the rest of the episode. But without any further ado, it's great to have you. I think the best place to start would be for those who don't know you, if you could just sort of tell your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and talk about some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here among, you've had a bunch of great guests and you've somehow turned the color blue into a trademark that I think of when I see it. So congratulations on that. But yeah, going back, I guess early beginning, grew up outside Philadelphia. Both my parents were consultants and then started their own businesses. So I have a little bit of that entrepreneurial thing in my background. Now my sister runs her own company. My brother both works with me and runs his own company, and I'm kind of running, this hodgepodge of things under the Not Boring banner. So I think that goes all the way back. Without doing the full history, I think there's probably a few different spots that pointed to where we are now. I remember when I was 6 years old, I think one of my dad's clients was the Miami Herald, the paper down in Miami. And so I was making my own like mini Miami Herald every day with Post-it notes, kind of writing a little newspaper. So that's probably the first time that I wrote. Went to Duke out of school, came, did the finance thing, went into banking, was bored a little bit by that, had wanted to be an entrepreneur, wasn't technical, wasn't ready to start my own business, but started a party bus company on the side, like kind of nights and weekends, taught myself to like build a really, really crappy website and took buses from New York to the Jersey Shore and New York to the Hamptons. So that was really the first kind of time that I scratched that itch, left finance after a few years, was going to go to business school. Last minute decided not to do that and went to a company called Breather. We did on-demand meeting and workspace in 10 different cities throughout the world. I started as our New York City general manager and then did a bunch of stuff at the company, was VP of experience, which was a weird title I ran our real estate, design, construction, operations, customer care, research, a bunch of teams that dealt with the physical product there. When our CEO left, was in the office of the CEO for a while, which I loved. And then we hired a management team that had experience at companies like eBay and BuzzFeed and whatever. I remember sitting in one of our exec team meetings and saying a medium-sized word, I think it was enumerate, and getting a bunch of blank looks from people in the room. And I was like, I think if what I loved about Breather before was that it was this really, really hard problem. We had 300 plus spaces all around the world that we had to rent out through an app for an hour to multiple days at a time and deliver catering and clean them and do all this complicated stuff, trying to figure out how to make a business out of that. And I think we had some really interesting kind of complex ways to do that. Getting all of that compressed down into like the simplest version of what that business could be just made me, I think I was pulling my hair out a little bit and just kind of thought that I was going to lose my edge if I didn't do something. So I took David Perel's online writing course, started writing just, a weekly roundup of links, got in the practice of doing it. COVID hit. I quit the job at Breather. One thing led to another, and now I'm a full-time newsletter writer, which is not what I ever would have expected to be doing with my life.
Yeah, there's a lot of twists and turns around the journey, and I know you told sort of like a longer version on Acquired, so people can go listen to that podcast as well if they're interested in untoggling some of the detail there. But I thought one of the more interesting chapters, or I guess inflection points, was like you mentioned, you were coming out of finance and looking to go to business school. I think you had your deposit in actually at Chicago, and
Yep.
basically somehow came up with the conviction at that time to drop that path, including the deposit, and sort of double down on this recruiting process with Breather, which you weren't even assured you were like fully going to get a job with the company. Can you talk about, like, if you sort of rewind back to that moment in time? I don't know how easy or hard it might be, but like, what gave you, this isn't just like leaving one option on the table for another, like there's an opportunity cost or whatever. Like you literally had a deposit in, you're sort of foregoing some money on this idea that like I can get this job with this startup that I haven't even gotten yet. Was that difficult, or like are you just sort of trusting your gut along the way? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in retrospect, maybe it sounds a little dumber. At the time, it kind of felt like the obvious thing to do. As soon as I got that idea in my mind that like I didn't really want to go to business school and it was just kind of delaying ultimately wanting to get into startups and doing something more entrepreneurial in a little bit of time. Once something flipped in my mind, it became like a really, really obvious choice that this is what I should be doing. I've always had a weird relationship with risk where like I just, you probably can tell this if you read the newsletter, like my brain just sees kind of what can go right and doesn't think as much about what can go wrong. And that can be a really good thing. And I think it was in this case, although there wasn't a great financial outcome, but a great experience outcome. Obviously can be a bad thing in certain cases as well. But in this case, I really just, I viewed it as I can go to business school, spend over $100,000 to then like at some point, maybe in the future, get a job at a startup or maybe go back into finance and do that a little bit longer so that I have the money to pay back business school and then go do what I want. And I was like, instead, I can just take a really significant pay cut because it will mean that I'm not actually like losing money like I would be going to business school. So I kind of have a couple of years to just experiment, make a lot less money than I did before, and learn in this kind of more practical, hands-on way. So in some ways, it almost seemed less risky because at least I was getting paid something and not paying something out of pocket and working kind of more closely towards what I wanted to be doing.
Right. And then so you get that great experience, sort of a few or several years there, and then you sort of move on, decide this isn't for you anymore, or things change, circumstances within the company, whatever. You sort of get the idea that you want to do your own thing. And the timing is just like horrific because you're trying to start this like IRL, communities business basically. And COVID hits like literally sort of the month that you're having your first in-person events in New York, I think it was.
Yeah.
So you decide to sort of double down on this other thing you were doing coming out of the rite of passage course that you mentioned. You're just sort of fooling around a little bit with doing this, email newsletter and pulling some links together, doing a little bit of writing. You take the name from the IRL business, Not Boring, slap it on to the email newsletter you've been working on, which I think was called, what was it? Per My Last Email, something like that.
It was, yeah.
And then sort of that's how Not Boring as we know it was born. How did you sort of, again, you're sort of taking a risk. You thought you were starting this business. Now you're like, well, I'm just gonna do this writing, which I wasn't even thinking as like the main thing I was doing anymore. You sort of double down on that. I think you gave yourself like maybe 3 months to see if you could sort of make something of it. What was
Yeah.
that 3 months like going from like 0 to 1?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of ways of looking at that timing. One, it was bad timing to try to start something IRL. Two, it was incredible timing for me, frankly, because had it been a couple of months later, I might have raised money, I might have signed a lease. And if I'm being honest with myself in retrospect, and even the people close to me at the time were telling me not a particularly like great or scalable idea. I don't love networking and being out every night and all of that. So like I don't think it was the exact right kind of founder market fit. Like all of that kind of stuff I think was a little bit wrong. And I'm pretty stubborn. So I think I would have kept going had there not been something just like very clear. You can't go build something where people meet in person. So I got a little bit lucky there on the timing, compared to what it could have been. I'm imagining myself like going and hosting debates every night or something right now, and it's just not what I should be doing. So happy to be doing the newsletter, but yeah, I mean those first few months of the newsletter were interesting because it was the very beginning of COVID. We were stuck inside. I had nothing to do but right, I got COVID out of the way super early. I think I got it in March of 2020. When I was writing some of my first pieces kind of under Not Boring, but I'd been sitting on the couch trying to bring Not Boring Club online, was preparing some like game show night that we were going to do on Zoom when people were doing things on Zoom in the early days. And my wife just kind of looked at me and was like, "What are you doing?" And I looked back and was like, "Yeah, what am I doing? I'm setting up like Jeopardy night or something for 7 people that are going to show up online. Like this just is not a thing." I do like writing. I've had a good time, writing the newsletter on the side for the last little bit. So like, what happens if I just go out and try to do this full time? I think we were probably at 1,000 subscribers after a year at that point, maybe even less. asked Pooja, my wife, if I could have 3 months of making zero money and having no plan other than the newsletter to try to grow it into something. And I think kind of fairly immediately, it started taking off, not in any crazy way. We did a product hunt launch, and it kind of doubled the number of people that we had to 3,000, and then kind of grew steadily from there. I was getting good feedback from people that I wasn't expecting to get good feedback from. And so there were all these like, not tangible, not money in my pocket kind of signs, but just like little signs are like, okay, this feels like there could be something here. Let me keep doing it. I mean, I think timing was kind of perfect. People were stuck inside. They had nothing else to do but read and spend time online. And I was writing thousands and thousands of words. And I don't think, if I were doing that right now, people would have the attention span or the time to kind of start building a relationship with a newsletter like that. But it was the right place and right time for it. And then at the end of 3 months, wasn't making any money on it still, but it had grown enough to like 5,000 or so people that it just felt like the right thing to keep trying to pursue, and very glad that I did.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you're saying sort of reminds me of like I always think of the advice, the general advice, like keep going, right? It's like, just keep going and like eventually it'll work. And I think of that as like on the one hand, some of the best advice ever, if you're sort of like doing the right thing. But it's also like kind of some of the worst advice ever. If you're like doing the wrong
Totally.
thing, you keep going. It's just like totally futile. And it sounds like, the business that you were working on, you probably sort of thought like I sort of heard some of the rationale for why you started this business in the first place, and it seemed like a really good idea. But at the end of the day, to your point, like the founder product market fit wasn't completely there. Like it wasn't something that you would have enjoyed doing day in and day out to the degree that you sort of would have needed to keep going. But then at the same time, you might have been sort of stubbornly persistent to see this thing through until there's a positive outcome. And next thing you know, like 10 or 15 years go by and you're working on this business that like you don't really want to be working on. Instead, you sort of had this turn of fate or whatever it might be that COVID hit and you got to focus on the newsletter, which was a much better fit for you personally, it sounds like. And
Yeah.
that was something where keep going was excellent advice and eventually, has proven to pay off. Going a little bit deeper into the newsletter and like the early days of writing and how things have progressed since, just zooming in on like the writing itself. How do you think like at that point, like, you took a course, you're kind of just starting to write very consistently. It sounds like you might have done some writing previously, but this is like more of a you're on a schedule and everything like that. How has your writing, evolved or developed over time or changed over time in terms of, whether it's like the system you have for writing itself or like the style or the topics that you like to cover, things you like to write about? Any changes that you can sort of think about, like looking back, like, wow, that was like actually pretty different back then versus what I'm doing now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of process, it's probably changed embarrassingly little. You'd think that 3 years into doing this, I'd have like a really nice process where on, Monday morning, I send the email, I give myself a few hours off, and then I'm back and I read 50 things and I'm taking diligent notes and then I do an outline. Like it just does not work like that at all for me still, where it's, spending a few days trying to figure out what I'm going to write about, panicking a little bit, kind of researching as I write and going back and forth. And now ChatGPT has become, part of that process where like I feel like I can push a little bit further out on what I'm writing about and have it kind of check me at least and say like, is this thing that I'm trying to say, like, does that make any sense at all? Is it internally consistent? Whatever. I think the biggest change in terms of content is in the beginning, I really wanted to, it took me a while to get to writing about kind of tech and business strategy because I was, worried that Ben Thompson did it so well that there was no room in the space for anybody else. So I wanted to do something unique. And so I did very explicit kind of intersections of something in tech or strategy or economics compared or mixed with something from pop culture. So like uh, creative destruction and the Mickey Mouse Club, or all those Zooms that we were on that we were talking about, and a Hey Arnold episode where they just had like way too many watches and couldn't get rid of them because there was a supply glut and what was going on in oil at the time, like all this stuff combined. And over time, I tried to keep kind of the fun, approachable tone from those pieces, but maybe drop the pop culture thing because it ended up being kind of trying to figure out like two different essays at the same time and then melt them together. And it just became like a ton of work and a little bit forced in some cases. And so figured that what people appreciated was the approachability and the tone for more serious topics that were written in a more fun way. So I think that's probably the biggest change. I'd say, probably a little bit more explicitly writing with an optimistic bent. I think that was something that was just naturally there. It's just naturally how my brain works and how I see the world. But now we read a piece called The Weekly Dose of Optimism every week. So more explicit about that. And then, I think still trying to find big, exciting, hard to understand things, learning it myself in real time, and then trying to write it in a way that I could explain as I'm there, that I could understand as I'm learning it, so that people who are interested in the subject and are smart but might not be as familiar with something can dig their teeth into it.
Right. I know you mentioned Ben Thompson, and like I've seen you said Ben Thompson plus Bill Simmons, you're kind of like the baby of the two in a way, in the way that you write and things. What do you see in those guys in particular, like each of them? Like what aspects do you think sort of when you say like, you're the combination of the two in a way, what aspects from each do you seek to, emulate, or do you aspire to emulate from the two of those guys? Because they're very, one's business focused, one's sports focused. I know you're interested in both. Curious to hear sort of how you look at them.
Yeah, I mean, definitely an aspirational comparison. I think they're both better by leaps and bounds at what they do than I am. But I think on the Ben Thompson side, it's really kind of keeping up with everything that's going on in tech and applying like a very clear lens to understand what's going on to fit the things that are happening now into a historical context. I just don't think anybody does kind of tech strategy analysis better than Ben Thompson does. So that's the aspiration on that side. And then on the Bill Simmons side, I do think it's more of that tone and comparing, sports, which is his main topic, to things happening in pop culture, and naming different weird concepts like the Ewing theory or whatever else, like making it really fun and like infusing that pop culture angle into something that is covered very much the same way pretty much everywhere else, where it's a bunch of talking heads just yelling at each other and people getting angry and all that kind of stuff, and having arguments, which is really fun. And I love regular sports talk radio, but he just took this unique angle to something that so many people had done for so long, and was able to kind of stand out by doing that. And so trying to infuse kind of the Bill Simmons fun with the Ben Thompson strong analysis was kind of the goal with that comparison.
Yeah, well, I feel like that's really worked pretty well. I mean, you're obviously, it's called Not Boring, and it tends to be not boring. It's like very fun the way that you write about business, which is traditionally like not, it's more of like a serious thing. Obviously, it's like not that, the first thing people think of when they think of like business strategy and analysis isn't like, oh yeah, fun, like for sure. So it's an interesting combination. It's obviously working out very well, and attracting a large number of people, and probably growing, well, obviously growing, but hopefully, growing for a long time to come. And so as it's been growing, you mentioned after like 3 months, you saw some growth, but still not monetizing. A few months thereafter, maybe still the case, but now you're monetized in sort of more ways than one. I think the first was doing like these sponsored posts, which was sort of a pretty interesting, like contrarian thing to do, given that like, it wasn't like natural at the time to think like, oh, like, yeah, I want to read this person's article about like a company, or essay about a company that like the company paid them to write. It's like sort of counterintuitive, but it makes sense from the perspective of like, there's all these like hit pieces out there from, traditional outlets or whatever it might be, that obviously the company's not paying them to write a hit piece on them, but it's like everything feels so disaligned. Like, what's wrong with a company paying someone who's writing they like to do a piece on them? And obviously you sort of trust the person to be reasonably objective, but a little optimism doesn't hurt. What gave you that sort of what spurred that like monetization model to begin with? And then if you could talk about like, well, maybe that first, but then maybe we'll talk about like sort of stages of monetization thereafter. Obviously you've sort of attached a fund to what you're doing now, and other elements as well.
Yeah, I think the credit for that goes to Nick Abazid, who's now at Ramp, who was at Main Street at the time, who reached out and asked about doing that. And I really, like, the first time when I wrote about Main Street, at the top of the post, I was like, as clear as I could possibly be that this is a sponsored post. Thought it was something that was useful for the audience. A lot of startup founders, a way to get money back wanted to be super, super clear that it was sponsored, and ask people like, if you hate this, let me know that you hate it. I won't do it again. And I think people ended up kind of liking it. That one, I think was probably shorter and more of an ad. Over time, they've become these like really in-depth pieces. I think the longest sponsored post I wrote was 16,000 words or something. And the way that I view them is, I wouldn't write about a company because they're willing to pay me that I wouldn't want to write about anyway. And the types of companies and the types of pieces that I'm writing about anyway are optimistic, because I'm picking companies that I want to write about because I'm excited about them. And so this is almost a way for them to just kind of like jump the line. It's companies that I, with infinite time, would write about anyway, but it's a way for them to kind of skip to the front of the line. And I find too that when companies are paying for the post, they put more into it and they give me more access, so I can get all of their past board decks and interviews with their founders and customers and people who might be critics of the company, and just get a lot more effort from their side than if I reached out and I was like, hey, I'm interested in writing a story about your company. Maybe now people would respond, but certainly in the beginning, I think having that kind of skin in the game actually got people to give me more access. One of the high points of the sponsored post journey was when Ben Thompson talked about it on his podcast, and was like, this is actually an interesting model, because one of the problems and one of the reasons that he didn't cover startups was that you can't get access to their financials. You can't get access to how they're actually doing behind the scenes. And so having this piece of it, like a way for them to feel motivated to give me all of this information, was a good way to kind of overcome a little bit of the problem. Obviously, like, it sets me up for critique when things don't go right. I mean, I think the assumption that I have when I'm writing about companies is like, I'm writing about the thing that excites me about this company. I will write about the risks, but like the default assumption when you're writing about early stage startups is that like they're probably going to fail at some point. And like, here's what it would take for them not to fail. And here's like the angle that I see on why they might not fail. But despite all of that, like if you write a sponsor post on a company and then they end up failing, it's an easy opportunity to dunk. So there's risk, but I actually think, in terms of the access that we're able to get and the depth that we're able to go into on those pieces, it's worth it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you went into it. I mean, I'm sure there's like a lot of different aspects that you sort of could think about in advance, but like the key thing was like, how do we monetize this thing without doing like traditional ads? And you come to this pretty nice solution that seems like it could work, and like you're a little hesitant with Main Street, but like, give it a shot. And then it turns out to solve this like completely different problem that I don't know if you anticipated, which is like this amazing access to information that you can't really get with the other posts. And just the effort on the company side, it's almost like, I know from doing these podcasts, like, I do all the prep work and everything like that. It's all on me. But if you had a guest come in who is like, paying you and, giving you all the information that you need to prep, or a lot of it at least, that's like, a double win at least. And there's probably some other good things that come out of it as well. One of which I guess is the investing ability. So some of these guys come in and they're paying you for a sponsored post, and you might be able to invest in them. I think that's actually how the first angel investment that you did came about. Is that right?
That was not a sponsor post. That was a friend of mine who I'd known for a while, back when he and his brother were doing, they were trying to figure out how to make walls that were like essentially robot walls that could shift and move, and you could snap plugs in certain spots, that addressed an issue that, if it had worked, would have been really useful for a company like Breather, where people want different size rooms all the time, but real estate is kind of what it is and doesn't change. So I'd known Fed Novikov for a while. He was starting this company, Apt. It was based on, the company wasn't based on, but like a lot of their strategy was based on something that I had written kind of like pre Not Boring. And so he's like, would you mind just like writing about our company? I think could be a kind of interesting one. We didn't do an SPV on that one, but I had a friend who was doing an SPV in the company, so I pointed people in the direction of that. And then the SPV filled up, and it was really great for the company, and like everything just kind of worked together. So I was like, oh wow, maybe I'll start doing this a little bit more. Not on the sponsored side. If we're doing an SPV, then it's just part of the process. We have to write this memo anyway. But that's kind of how one thing led to another. I started doing a few SPVs, writing about the companies. And then when that became a little bit too much of a pain, doing it one off each time, both for me and for, I think, some excellent companies wouldn't necessarily want to take an SPV, particularly in that market when they had a million different choices. I decided to go the fund route.
Right. And that was like a pretty quick transition, right? From like starting angel investing to actually raising a formal fund. I think now you're on fund three already after like a pretty short period of time. Can you sort of intro your thinking about like how do I attach a fund to everything I'm doing with the newsletter, why it makes sense, and how sort of like some of the early investing, like what you've learned in the early stages of doing this investing?
Yeah, it's probably the number one question that I get from LPs and potential LPs is like, when do you have time to do the fun stuff because you're writing? Like, how do you split them? How do you think about these two separate things? When are you going to stop writing and just focus fully on the fund? I like really, really, really view them as part of the same thing. I think the writing helps a lot, particularly on the sourcing side and the ability to win deals. I think when we write about even categories and not companies specifically, it kind of plants a flag and lets people know that we're excited about that particular space. So if we start writing more about biotech, or if we start writing more about space, it's just a good way of saying like we're interested here and we have at least an understanding and hopefully an interesting view on what's going on in this market. And then it's just a very clear value add for founders when we can write a check and then help tell their story both kind of publicly and behind the scenes and help with board decks and all of that kind of stuff. And so have designed kind of I think a fairly consistent fund strategy where we're not going to be the lead check, we're not taking board seats, but we want to be the second or third biggest check in a round in an early stage company, kind of pushing the frontiers in some way or another. That could be on the bit side and on that side of things. That ends up being a fair amount of crypto and infrastructure. It could be on the atom side, which ends up being a fair amount of biotech. We're looking at a chips company right now. We're looking at a bunch of companies in kind of energy and climate. But these companies that are the ones that we're naturally excited about and want to write about and want to dig into those categories and want to talk to people in the space are the ones that we end up investing in. And I think it all just kind of fits together better than I could have anticipated. It was not at all part of the plan to start a fund from the beginning, but I think the two go really well together when you do it right.
Right. And like, did you consider, I think you're using AngelList, right? But it's not a rolling fund or is it?
It's not a rolling fund, so it's a regular fund with AngelList as the fund admin.
Did you consider the rolling fund at all, or did you like how did you come to AngelList traditional fund as sort of what made most sense for you?
Yeah, I thought about the rolling fund a little bit. I frankly didn't give it a ton of thought, just because I wanted it to feel more like a real fund. I think AngelList is kind of phenomenal and underrated as just like a good fund admin product. They keep moving kind of up the stack in terms of fund size, in terms of their capabilities. Having, I work with someone over there named Colt, who works on the fund with me, who's just excellent. Like it's like having another member of the team. They just handle a bunch of the back office stuff that it frankly doesn't make sense for a small fund that's not leading to deal with. So they've just been a really phenomenal fund admin. I'm excited to see them kind of move up and go more institutional, and hopefully can kind of keep growing with them as long as I go. But it just felt like a natural fit, having worked with the team on doing a bunch of the SPVs over there, and just seeing how smooth everything is. That could have been very expensive and a lot of back and forth and paperwork and back office stuff that just got taken off the plate when I'm doing both kind of writing and investing as a solo GP and the only person at the time writing on the newsletter. It just, having something that was able to take all of that off my plate was huge, but I did want it to feel like a real fund and not have it be a rolling fund.
Yeah, it's crazy. I have some, a little bit of experience with working with AngelList myself, and they're amazing. And like all of these platforms, at the end of the day, it's just amazing what you can do as one person. But at the same
Yeah.
time, like I know you're bringing a team together now. Your brother's doing some writing, and I think he's helping you on the investing side as well. How do you think about, like you mentioned, incorporating ChatGPT into your writing a little bit? Obviously, you wrote the piece on, talking about plugins and how you see the future for OpenAI and everything like that. How do you think about like in the world we are in today, where things are changing at a million miles an hour? AI seems to be the thing right now, obviously, but a year or two ago it was crypto, and think we would both agree that crypto is going to have its moment in the sunlight again pretty soon, hopefully,
Yeah.
or at some point, whether it's 6 months or a couple years, whatever it might be. Everything's moving like very fast, particularly on the AI side. how do you think like, should I build a team of people? Should I like just go all in on ChatGPT and learn how to use these plugins and like see what I can do with myself or a team of two or a team of three or whatever it might be? It seems like building anything. I mean, obviously what you're doing is fairly unique in and of itself, that you're sort of started with the Substack and you attach the fund. You got like a jobs board as well. You're just sort of piecing some things together in a formula that we're seeing sort of other people are doing kind of similar things, but everyone's like got their own flavor, and there's very few of these people sort of doing it well and successfully in the early goings. I'm just curious, I guess, on team building versus sort of like platform using or whatever you might want to call it.
Yeah.
How you think about building not boring here forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer for almost everything, like, something probably that I over index on more than the average person would just be differentiation. So if there's something that I'm not going to be the best at, like doing back office and fund admin work with a platform, like, take that off your plate. That's not where not boring is going to differentiate, or not boring capital is going to differentiate. And so working with somebody like AngelList, who can be really, really excellent in that and can use AI where it makes sense to do some of those things, like, please take that off my plate, and do as good of a job as you possibly can. And so that I don't have to try to build world-class capabilities on something that's not going to make any difference to founders or to my LPs. In terms of the newsletter itself, I don't see myself probably having ChatGPT even write a first draft, or certainly write a piece for a very long time. Like, where I try to use it now is, if I don't understand if I have an idea, but like there's some point that I want to make that I'm not sure if I'm making it right, like, it's more of a conversation that I'll have with it. So I think to be cliche about it, like, it enhances me, but it doesn't replace me yet. And maybe GPT-5 will, and it'll be a different conversation. In terms of team building, I mean, I for what we do, really like the idea of finding people who are just exceptional at a particular thing. And so, we have Elliot Hirschberg on the team, who's our biotech partner, who is getting his PhD in genomics at Stanford. He writes my favorite biotech newsletter, Century of Biology, which is how we found each other. And so I want to find, even if it's part-time, I want to find people who excel at a particular thing that I think we should be really, really good at. In this case, it's biotech, and we hopefully can find an Elliot in space and climate and energy, and in a few different areas. And then on back office stuff, like, let's use Substack and not reinvent the wheel and try to build our own email client, all that kind of stuff. I'm happy to outsource to platforms, but I want to have a few very exceptional people on the team.
So obviously Substack's been sort of like the go-to for people writing newsletters and essays for a little while now. Twitter's obviously changing pretty quickly with Elon at the helm. Are you seeing anything there that has like piqued your interest, just in terms of, the subscriptions or the videos, or anything going on Twitter that you're keeping an eye on, of like, oh, Not Boring's next big move might be to do something more explicitly on Twitter than just you're tweeting or something informal like that, where you might actually sort of invest your time and energy in Twitter as a platform more than you have in the past? Or is
I
everything
can't
kind of early and uninteresting a little bit so far?
I've like never, I've written about Twitter a bunch of times. I've been a big fan. I wouldn't, Not Boring wouldn't be what it is without Twitter. I've met a bunch of really great people through Twitter. I was optimistic about Elon taking Twitter over. I can't imagine making a big investment it just seems too unstable to make a big investment on Twitter right now. And I know personally, like, I still use Twitter. I deleted the app from my phone, but then I'll go on the mobile version. Like, it's certainly some sort of addiction, but I don't feel good about it. Like, I really used to like love being on Twitter, and I don't love being on Twitter anymore. And I've talked to a bunch of people who I think feel the same way about it. It's just like a weirder platform, to me at least, than it used to be, and not weird in a good way. I think Twitter used to be good weird. So I can't see myself right now. I'm open to changing it, but I can't see myself right now investing too much in Twitter. I think if anything, like, I've taken it less seriously. My tweets have gotten worse. I don't care if they get engagement, like all that kind of stuff. I've just kind of stopped caring about, because it doesn't seem worth the mental energy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what to make of Twitter myself either. I joined like very late. I mean, I played around with it like, a decade ago or whatever in the early days, but then didn't I just sort of like ignored it and then got on, 3 years ago, I think, something like that. And in the beginning, it helped sort of get the podcast off the ground a little bit, build a small little following, whatever, learned a lot of ththings, learned about people who I wasn't sort of aware of, stuff like that. And now I'm sort of more on a similar page as you are, where it's like, this doesn't really make me feel great to like be on this,
Yeah.
for several hours a week or whatever it might be. And you just get sort of trapped in it. It's like, it's so hard. I think Paul Graham had this thing about it where it's like, it's so good and so bad that you can't really figure out if it's like net good or net bad because it's just like so impactful, basically. And so I don't know, I'm kind of like you, I delete the mobile app and then I end up on the web Safari or whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
I'm trying my
And then it's
best
just
to,
frustrating. Yeah, 'cause it's like a worse, you're still doing it on your phone and it's like a slightly worse experience because you're not using the native app. And it's not, Twitter's fault that the experience is bad because you're not using the product that you should be. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I used to learn a bunch on Twitter and now it's just like videos of people beating up homeless people. And it's like, maybe I've like lingered on those videos too long when they pop up in the For You feed, but just like the overall tone, I would say, and maybe it's a bear market. Like I think there's other factors that are non-Twitter related, but like the overall tone is just not as fun or educational or just like kind of something where every time I catch myself on Twitter, I'm like, man, what a waste of time that just was.
so have you played around with any, do you think there's going to be like a next Twitter that sort of feels like the positive energy or the good stuff that you used to get from being on Twitter, whether it's, Farcaster or Lens or one of the crypto oriented, social platforms? Are you playing around with any of that stuff or
Yeah.
thinking about what might be next in that space?
Yeah, so I'm on, I think probably pinned in my Arc browser on my like kind of home sidebar. I have Blue Sky, which seems kind of like fun and weird, but still very much Twitter. I have Substack Notes, which I wish they hadn't been a little bit more opinionated on making it more kind of writing and ideas focused. It does some things really well. I like the quoting ability. I like the ability to tag other writers, all of that, but like it does feel a little Twittery. And then Farcaster, I think, is probably the most, particularly in the context of crypto, the most educational and the most that feels like what I liked about Twitter when I started using it a lot more in 2020, where I'm learning a lot from being there, where people are going back and forth and having interesting conversations. I think the promise in something like Farcaster or Lens or a protocol on top of which a bunch of apps can build is that hopefully you lower the bar and let people experiment a little bit more. Like I don't love that all of the kind of Twitter alternatives are very much Twitter. Like I'm definitely from the Eugene Way status as a service school where like there needs to be some new proof of work and some new way that people can kind of stand out in a new platform for it to really, really break out. And so what I hope for these open protocols is that they bring down the cost of developing new social products so low and you already have your username set up and you can help fix the cold start problem and all of that such that people can like really experiment and try new things. We'll see. I would love an algorithm that like encouraged novelty in some way. And I don't know exactly how that would work, but like seeing all of the AI threads happening right now, it's like the exact same format because that format works. I want to see an algorithm that does like the opposite thing where the more novel your idea or the more novel the format you use, the more it gets elevated. But that I'm not a product person, so I have no idea how that would work or if that would work. But I do want to see a little bit more experimentation in these new social products.
Yeah, I forget. It's interesting you say that. I forget if I tweeted this or I was thinking it or something like that. I might have taken a note or something, but I was like, because those exact threads that you're talking about are like probably the top of my list of things that make me want to get off Twitter when I'm on Twitter and like not open
Yeah,
it and end up in the web app like we were talking about or whatever. But I think like the thing I was thinking about is like, the algorithm could probably figure out like, hey, is this like one of those Twitter threads that you sort of know it when you see it? And can I, as a user, like you can't do this on Twitter today, and maybe they could install some setting, but it's more easy to imagine with these different protocols, like an app could come out that lets you sort of adjust in your settings, like I actually don't want to see any of these threads. Like if it looks like this type of thread thing, like if it has a thread score of like a 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10,
Yep.
like I don't want to see it. And also to your point on like novelty, it's like, that to me sort of counters the like current thing aspect of the social media as well, where it's like if everyone is tweeting about like, you know, this was it was a great Elon's interview with CNBC yesterday or 2 days ago or whatever. It was a great interview. I
Yeah.
really liked it, but like I don't want literally every tweet or like when, it's weird because he's like now the current thing on his own social media thing all the time, basically. But when he hired the CEO, like I swear my feed was like, or when he announced that he was hiring the CEO and it wasn't yet known who it was, like every other tweet was like a female version of Elon as like a picture, like saying it was going to be like Alana or whatever. And then
Yep.
the second one was I forget who it was. It's another like pretty dumb joke. And I was like, this is just like I'm getting dumber basically on here. So you should be able to like sort of downrank like the current thing as well. And I think that to me is like part of the appeal of the protocols is that people can design whatever apps they want and use the same like information that's across the protocol and surface it in different ways and give people different options. I don't know how it's all going to play out. And I think the big step that hasn't yet been sort of achieved is whether it's like BitClout or Farcaster, any of these, they haven't really, maybe Lens has done it. I'm not really as active on Lens or
Me
whatever.
neither.
I'm mostly on Farcaster these days, but um, I haven't really seen like a big ecosystem of clients where like a ton of them or like even a few of them or a couple of them are like super popular. It tends to be like BitClout failed to get off of BitClout.
Yep.
Farcaster for me, I'm mostly using Warpcast is I think is what the app's called now. And that step one of going from not so much 0 to 1 but like 1 to 2 in terms of clients seems like a pretty pivotal thing that's going to need to be overcome.
100% agree. It's interesting your point on the current thing, because there is some of that we lost, that everybody used to watch the same shows and everybody used to watch the news and kind of be on the same page, and so there were all these cultural moments that aren't there to the same extent. And so it is fun sometimes when that thing happens on Twitter. Is I do want the ability to toggle that on and off. Like for the World Cup finals, I want to toggle that on, and I want it to all be that. And I love the fact that everybody around the whole world is tweeting about the same thing. But to your point, when it's just these like little micro dramas or like everybody making the same joke over and over again, like that's not as fun. So yeah, we need a product genius and like a social media savant to come out and kind of rethink the interfaces and how that could work. I feel like AI probably helps sift through a bunch of this stuff, but there really are times when I want us all to be really, really excited about it. I think, Elon is like the great duality of man kind of test or example or whatever now, where like I think SpaceX launches end up being these like incredibly inspiring events that at least my corner of Twitter gets really, really excited about. And I want to be a part of that. And I want everybody to be talking about that. But like, do I want everybody to be talking about, the way that Twitter handled Turkey? Like after the first four tweets, I like kind of get people's two takes on that. Some people are going to hate it no matter what. Some people, Elon, to steal the Trump thing, could shoot somebody in the face on Fifth Avenue and he'd have a million people in the replies defending him in the same exact way. And so when it's that predictable, then it gets kind of boring pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think not all current things are equal is the
Yeah.
sort of moral of the story. And there are definitely some where it feels nice to be like a part of something. I think obviously that's like lacking feeling or sense for like a lot of people, just given, everyone's like working remotely from home, like literally on their own all day versus used to be in an office or whatever it might be. And communities, like in-person communities seem to be, not like they used to be and whatnot. And so not really sure what replaced all that. And like you said, we need a product genius or something to come in and I'm not the guy, but maybe someone listening is and will build something like this that can sort of solve some of these problems. So zooming out a little bit, coming back to not boring, I think we've got like 5 to 10 minutes left and appreciate the time and everything like that. I want to hear a little bit your zoomed out like roadmap for not boring, to the extent that you have one, is totally fair to be like, taking things one day at a day, one day at a time, and like thinking about what I'm doing now and not too forward looking in the future. But you did mention like, we could find like a space guy who's like our bio guy, or an AI guy who's like our bio guy. So suggests like maybe you're thinking about bringing in more like domain specific people on the writing side. Just any ideas that you have for the future of what you're building, and what not boring might look like 3, 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah. I mean, I think my overall approach is fairly one day at a time and try to make the content as good as possible and all of that. But if I do zoom out and look to the future a little bit, I mean, I think that's the big one is can we broaden the kind of base of the types of stories that we're able to tell really well, right? Like I think there's going to be a lot of really important stuff that happens in biotech that will get drowned out by the stuff happening on Twitter, because everybody's familiar with Twitter and everybody like is kind of part of that ongoing conversation and can understand the concepts really, really easily. Whereas like the bio stuff is going to be more important, but it does take a little bit more knowledge and nuance to appreciate. And so like, how do you both tell the story in a compelling way without losing that nuance and get people excited about that, or get people excited about what's happening in space? Or, I think there's been a really good push kind of on the climate side recently towards energy abundance and all of that, as opposed to just degrowth or whatever. But like, how do you tell those stories in a way that people really understand what's going on and get familiar with the players, say in fusion, right? Like we're at this really interesting moment after 70 years of fusion research where it's been, the baton has a little bit been passed from government funded large scale international projects to this diffusion of 30 or so kind of commercial fusion companies, each taking different approaches and now really racing to that commercialization finish line. Like people should know the names of the people running those companies and know a little bit about the different approaches that they're taking and be able to stay abreast of their ability to kind of get to commercialization. Because if that happens, then everything changes. And I'm maybe the right guy to write the like, all right, here's me as like a medium intelligence guy coming in from the outside and trying to understand what's important. And I feel like most of the audience is kind of in the same spot that I am on Fusion, where you kind of think that it's important, but you don't really understand it. So I can write that intro piece, but then in terms of like really staying abreast of what's happening and thinking about how the different business models might work, but there's probably someone better in the world who can tell that story in a little bit of the not boring style, but with their own twist and with their own knowledge. So, to the extent that we do expand and grow, I do think that's the way that we do it. And I want to push that on both the venture side and the newsletter side and have it all work together, that we're both investing in and telling the stories of the companies that are pushing things forward. Like, obviously the market is not great. The market for startup funding is not great and all of that kind of stuff. But this feels like we're in the beginning of a decade or 2 decade period where so much is going to change, and hopefully so much is going to change for the better. And so part of the unintentional mission, I mean, I think the official mission is now to make the world more optimistic, but part of the unintentional mission is like, just get people to not take such a pessimistic and negative stance to kind of anything new that's trying, and to not view failures as like this end of the world thing where there's like all these nefarious characters running around. Like certainly in some cases there are nefarious characters, but for the most part, people are trying something really hard. They're raising the money that they think they need to be able to do it. And oftentimes those hard things don't work out. Like how do you celebrate that no matter what? And then like rally behind the ones that actually are working so that we can build towards something that is going to be good for a lot of people.
Yeah, so you mentioned the mission, make the world more optimistic. You had a great piece called Optimism, which you wrote. I think a great place to end is to talk a little bit about like, why is that your mission? That's not like an obvious mission for a business, newsletter or whatever, not boring, or I think no like abbreviated title can really capture what you're doing with not boring very briefly. But regardless, make the world optimistic isn't like a it is very optimistic. It's not an obvious mission. So I'm curious, like, how did you come to that? And you sort of have hinted at like the mainstream media just doesn't really do tech any favors for some reason, seems to kind of enjoy like, putting down people who have failed and trying to tear down people who are succeeding, things like this. Um, I think a great place to end basically would be sort of why optimism is so important to you and the mission of not boring.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I mentioned a couple times, probably just the way that I'm naturally wired to see the world. But I think as I've written Not Boring and been out there writing about companies for the past few years and invested in companies and gotten to know these founders, I don't have like I think the mainstream media, like I don't even like using the phrase mainstream media because I don't think it's a bad thing. Do I think like journalism is what it used to be? Like maybe not, but a lot of things aren't what they used to be, or at least like don't feel like they used to be. So I don't know if it's necessarily that, but there's just this like overall attitude on the internet, and maybe it's Twitter, maybe it's the bear market again, I don't know, where like snark wins and figuring out like the best way to dunk on something wins. We have a company in the portfolio called Pipe Dream that I think I talked about in that piece that's doing hyper logistics. They're doing tubes with robots under cities to deliver things in under $1 in under 10 minutes, and it's this like huge ambitious thing. And I remember Garrett, the CEO, tweeted about the company and just got ripped apart for the ambition that they were going after, and literally like the easiest dunk in the world to call it a pipe dream. And like I remember seeing that he handled it great. I was more bothered by it than he was. And then yesterday they're getting a ton of love because they announced that they signed a deal with Wendy's where they're going to be doing delivery from inside the restaurant out to the car so people can just drive in and pick up, and then it enables autonomous delivery down the line. And so like just seeing those things where like people are doing these really hard, impossible sounding things getting dunked on in the short term and then like actually going out and executing on it. If you could just make their lives a little bit easier and celebrate people doing these things that are the natural inclination is to dunk on them for being so hard or out there sounding, I think you just encourage more big shots on goal. And so I think that's really it. It's just kind of seeing the reaction to things that I'm excited about and seeing people's automatic reaction, maybe because of the way that they read about it in the press, maybe just because it's the easiest way to get likes, or maybe because like they just actually don't think it's going to work. But I don't know. Just getting to see how the blood, sweat, and tears that people are pouring into these things that then other people are like, that's never going to work, or that's stupid. I just like that bugs me to no end. And so if we can figure out a way to explain, one, that a lot of these things are going to fail and that's totally fine, but then two, that some of them are going to work and it's really going to hopefully make the world better for a lot of people, it feels like a good thing to be able to do. I mean, you brought up crypto before. I think that's a great example of like everybody's jumping on it while it's down. I think VR is my favorite example, or metaverse right now, where like that's been getting dunked on for the past X number of months. And then Apple's going to come out with their headset and it's going to be awesome. And people are going to be like, that's actually pretty cool. Like, it's not the stupid Facebook metaverse, but like, this is pretty cool. And like everything goes through the Gartner hype cycle, and it gets overhyped for a little while and then it gets dunked on. And then, so like, that's just part of life. But I don't know. I think things, given the right shot and the right smart people behind them, end up kind of working out at the end. And so if we could just skip the middle part where people are getting shit on for doing the thing that they feel called to do, I would love that to be the case.
Totally agree, and very much rooting for you guys on your mission. You guys are doing the weekly dose of optimism. I think everyone could use at least a daily dose, if not an hourly dose of optimism, and Twitter's not necessarily delivering that all the time. So hopefully we can get it from Not Boring, or Not Boring inspires a bunch of people to just be more optimistic. I tend to sort of suffer or benefit from the same affliction that you've described of just generally taking a very optimistic view on things, sometimes to a fault. But it feels like a pretty pleasant way to be most of the time. So anyway, speaking of pleasant, very good time speaking with you, Packy. Appreciate you coming on the show and taking the time. Where can people go to get engaged? Obviously follow the newsletter, follow you on Twitter, even if you aren't paying as much attention these days. And can people go and invest in your fund, if not this one, future ones? Where can people go to just get involved?
Yeah. So you can follow the newsletter at notboring.co. I'm on Twitter at PackyM. I want to be there less, but I'm still tweeting dumb stuff. I'm probably just putting a little less thought into what I tweet. So apologies in advance. And then, yeah, I mean, accredited investors can potentially invest in the fund. I wrote a post on it earlier in the year. So if you look up Not Boring Fund 3, there's a link to an Airtable there to submit interest. But I think notboring.co and Packy M on Twitter are probably the best spots.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Packy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.